20 years ago, many same-sex couples made history at Cambridge City Hall. It was just after midnight, and they said their vows just after a Supreme Judicial Court ruling took effect, making Massachusetts the first state in the country to legalize gay marriage. Those ceremonies and tens of thousands that have followed are thanks to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court ruling in Goodridge v. Department of Public Health. The case, brought by 7 couples represented by Gay, Lesbian Advocate and Defenders, or GLAD, paved the way for several more states and ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court to follow suit. I'm joined now by Arline Isaacson, the president of Isaacson Political Consulting, who led that lobby effort for the marriage ruling back in the early 2000s, and Ben Klein, GLAD's senior director of litigation and HIV law. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So we all know landmark decisions don't happen overnight. And so this took a long time to get this ruling right here in the state of Massachusetts. So, Ben, talk to me a little bit about what that fight looked like.
Well, the road to the Goodridge decision was really decades in the making. And there were really a number of prerequisites that had to be in place before you could do something as monumental as bring a case challenging the exclusion from the institution of marriage. And it really goes back to decades to the AIDS epidemic. And the reason I say the AIDS epidemic is lesbian gay people had been invisible in American society. And people did not understand the ways that gay and lesbian couples were harmed by the denial of any kind of legal recognition for their relationships. So during the AIDS epidemic, it was really transformative because even though there was so much suffering and death, people saw loving gay couples taking care of each other, but they also saw people denied hospital visitation for their loved ones. They saw people who were estranged from their families because they'd been rejected by their families, and then after death, the family swoops in, takes control of the body, sometimes excludes the surviving spouse from a funeral or even kicking them out of the home they lived in. So that really changed the visibility of couples and helped people to understand the harms. And, you know, you also had to pass basic protections. And Arline was one of the lobbyists passing the the lesbian and gay sexual orientation non-discrimination law in 1989. And you needed those basic building blocks in place so that lesbian and gay people were not strangers to the courts. They were not strangers to the legislature. So all those things had to be in place, and then you still had fierce resistance to the efforts towards marriage equality for same-sex couples.
Arline, talk a little bit more about laying that foundation before this decision.
Well, Ben's description is very accurate, and before the Goodridge decision, we had to fight to get the legislature to not vote on the issue of marriage equality. We had essentially a 10-year battle before we had enough votes to support marriage equality. And before the Goodridge decision, we needed the legislature to not vote on it because we knew we were going to lose overwhelmingly. The culture and the political environment were stacked against us big time. Once the Goodridge decision took place and was decided, then we had several more years of intense and hellish battles in order to keep the legislature from repealing the Goodridge decision and changing our Constitution to make it unconstitutional for us to get married. So it took us approximately 10 years, and it was very challenging. But every single year we saw that we were getting more and more support in the culture. Every year, more and more support in the legislature. And if we could buy enough time, we knew that eventually people would change their minds. We needed time in order to persuade people that our relationships were worth protecting.
And we know that there has been challenges to the decision. I'm sure that's something that GLAD and others were prepared for. Like that was only one step of a larger campaign.
Well, that's right. I mean, the Goodridge decision being the first decision establishing marriage equality in the country was celebrated as this incredible breakthrough, acknowledging that there was no justification under the equality and liberty principles of the Massachusetts Constitution to exclude same-sex couples. And then, of course, you're looking for the second state. All of these cases are brought under state constitutions because we were not ready for this case to go to the U.S. Supreme Court. back in 2003 and the years that followed. And yet, after the Massachusetts decision, every court to consider the issue until 2008 rejected it. And the opposition was fierce. There was this deeply entrenched notion that marriage was just inherently a man-woman institution. And so definitionally, there was no way to include same-sex couples. And so it took a long time and several battles in the courts, and then after that in the legislatures, before the case was even possible to get to the U.S. Supreme Court, which in 2015, of course, in the Obergefell decision, ruled that it was unconstitutional under the federal Constitution to exclude same-sex couples. And we now live in a country where that is not only the law of the land, but 3/4 of the people support it.
Yeah. You know, we actually, speaking of the courts, we actually have a piece of sound from former Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court Chief Justice Margaret Marshall on Boston Public Radio. She was on last Friday speaking about this decision and how huge it was for her. So let's take a listen.
My greatest concern is the number of times that people, gay people, people who've been married, not married, have come up to me and saying, are we safe? I believe in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts we are as safe as we can be anywhere. However, we are a national country. It goes slowly, it goes across the country, and judges have influence.
Arline, I'd love for you to respond to that, because we know this interview was, wide sweeping and amazing. But talk to us a little bit about that feeling of lack of safety.
She's right. There continues to be a sense of vulnerability. Massachusetts was the first state to win the right to marry in the courts, and we were the first state to defeat marriage prohibitions. 40 other states passed those marriage prohibitions. And so there is a sense of vulnerability that our Supreme Court has undone abortion rights, for example, recently. Might they try and undo this? And so there's some nervousness around it, and people do feel vulnerable. But we are prepared to fight. If they try and do it, we'll fight it in the courts with the brilliant lawyers that Ben represents, and we'll fight it in the state houses to make sure that we keep this right.
Is there always a current concern as sort of the tides shift in the country? Certainly since 2016, things have, I think most folks can say, made a lot of people feel unsafe in the country. Is there always a concern that this might be the next piece of legislation, the next law of the land that will be chopped down?
Well, the thing that's really important to remember, and that I think people were reflecting on the 20th anniversary of Goodridge, is that marriage equality was never intended to be the end point of the movement for liberation. And we have faced fierce resistance during the marriage equality years, and it hasn't disappeared. I mean, it has points where it flares up much more prominently than at other times. And right now, we are facing relentless attacks against LGBTQ people all across the country. 24 states have banned health care for transgender adolescents, essential medical care, that's standard of care endorsed by all authoritative medical organizations. Young people can't thrive under those circumstances. We're seeing book banning, attempts to curtail curriculum, challenges to school policies that are meant to protect LGBTQ people. So we have always been vigilant, and the movement for the full inclusion and participation of LGBTQ people in our society continues. It was never finished, and we're living in a world now where people are vulnerable, people are concerned, not just LGBTQ people, but so many people who are feeling under attack and not protected.
Absolutely. I actually wanted to play another bit of sound that we have from Maureen Brodoff, I'm sorry, how was it? Brodoff, excuse me. A plaintiff in the Goodridge decision, sharing how she feels about the ongoing fight for civil rights today. So take a listen here.
We've been here before. We've certainly had to fight for our rights, and I think that you can't be complacent. And I think that's the message of today, is that we need to be optimistic, but we need to continue to work to help other people understand our positions and come along with us.
Arline, I'm going to give you the last word here to respond to that.
She's absolutely right. You know, what's that adage about the price of democracy is eternal vigilance. I just ruined it, said it wrong. But the fact of the matter is we can't rest on our laurels about the rights we won, because they can in fact be taken away. And we will have to be eternally vigilant to make sure that that doesn't happen for us and for others as well.
Arline Isaacson and Ben Klein, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.